Fort McHenry's history began in 1776 during the Revolutionary War. The people of Baltimore feared an attack by the British and wanted to build a fort for protection. Anticipating an attack at any time, a fort of earthen mounds was constructed quickly. Originally, it was called Fort Whetstone because of its location on Whetstone Point. Whetstone Point was an excellent location for a fort for two reasons. It was located far enough from Baltimore to provide protection without endangering the city, and the area was a peninsula, a body of land surrounded on three sides by water. Constructing the fort on this site meant that enemy ships sailing into Baltimore would have to pass the fort first. The Revolutionary War ended without an attack on Baltimore, but improvements to the fort continued. In 1798, a French engineer was directed by the Secretary of War to draw plans for a new fort on Whetstone Point. These plans were expensive, and it was difficult for the people of Baltimore to raise money for construction. However, James McHenry, a well-known politician, was instrumental in raising funds for the new fort. The fort was named Fort McHenry in his honor. Fort McHenry became famous when the British tried to attack Baltimore during the War of 1812. When the bombardment began on September 13, 1814, there were 1,000 soldiers defending the fort. Some were federal soldiers who were stationed at Fort McHenry all the time. Many were volunteers from the city of Baltimore. Their commanding officer was Major George Armistead. For 25 hours, the British bombarded Fort McHenry, but the fort's artillery fire kept the British away. Baltimore was saved. One member on board the American ship was none other than Francis Scott Key, a deeply religious man who at one time in his life almost gave up his law practice to enter the ministry. Instead, he resolved to become involved in the Episcopal Church. Because of his religious beliefs, Key was strongly opposed to the War of 1812. However, due to his deep love for his country, he did serve for a brief time in the Georgetown Field Artillery in 1813. During the War of 1812, Dr. William Beans, a close friend of Key's, was taken prisoner by the British. Since Key was a well-known lawyer, he was asked to assist in efforts to get Dr. Beans released. Knowing that the British were in the Chesapeake Bay, Key left for Baltimore. There, Key met with Colonel John Skinner, a government agent who arranged for prisoner exchanges. Together, they set out on a small boat to meet the Royal Navy. On board the British flagship, the officers were very kind to Key and Skinner. They agreed to release Dr. Beans. However, the three men were not permitted to return to Baltimore until after the bombardment of Fort McHenry. The three Americans were placed aboard the American ship and waited behind the British fleet. From a distance of approximately 8 miles, Key and his friends watched the British bombard Fort McHenry. In the 1860s, the United States was torn apart by the Civil War. Union troops were stationed at Fort McHenry to help keep Baltimore out of the hands of those who would have Maryland join the Southern cause. The fort's guns were turned toward the city. Fort McHenry was used as a prison where political prisoners suspected of being Confederate sympathizers were held, often without trial. Many Confederate soldiers were imprisoned at the fort as well. In 1917, during the First World War, General Hospital No. 2 was established at Fort McHenry by the War Department. It was the largest military hospital in the country, with over 100 temporary buildings to accommodate wounded American soldiers returning from the war in Europe. After 25 hours of continuous bombing, the British decided to leave, since they were unable to destroy the fort as they had hoped. Realizing that the British had ceased the attack, Key looked toward the fort to see if the flag was still there. To his relief, the flag was still flying. Quickly, he wrote down the words to a poem, which was soon handed out as a handbill under the title Defense of Fort McHenry. It was renamed the Star-Spangled Banner by an adoring public. It became a popular patriotic song It was not until 1931, however, that it became our national anthem. When the war ended, the need for the hospital slowly diminished, and in 1925, the temporary buildings were torn down. Fort McHenry became a national park, which today is administered by the National Park Service as the country's only national monument and historic shrine. Exhibits around the fort will help you visualize life at Fort McHenry during the various stages of its history.